So the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community fosters innovative, co-produced research into placed histories across all regions and periods, from the rural to the urban and the parish to the metropolis, with an emphasis on the localised, the micro-historical and the site-specific. We're home to projects including the Victoria County History of England and the digital crowdsourced mapping project Layers of London. And of course, it is the Victoria County History, or VCH, that we're celebrating this evening, a project founded in 1899 and dedicated to Queen Victoria, which is how it gets its name, which aims to write the history of every place in England from the very earliest times to the present day, and active right across the country, working with local communities, local people in their places. And this evening, we are celebrating a major milestone for the Victoria County History Project, the publication of our 250th iconic Big Red Book of County History. And this is on the historic county of Westmorland, Volume 1 for Westmorland, produced by the VCH in Cumbria, the Cumbria County History Trust. Now, at this point, I will plug that there is a live discount with Boydell and Brewer, which is working. So for a 25% discount on this wonderful new volume that you're going to hear lots about this evening, you need to use the code BB132. And this evening, we'll also be using this wonderful VCH milestone as a way to celebrate the vitality and importance of local and place-based history more broadly. I know there are many of you in the room with your own perspectives on this and your own memories and stories of being part of VCH Big Red Books. And we're really looking forward to drawing you into discussion for you to share some of that. So I'm going to begin by introducing Dr. Sarah Rose, fresh from the launch of Westmorland Volume 1 in Cumbria last night, which we hear was an absolutely wonderful festive occasion, bursting at the seams. Sarah is based in the Regional Heritage Centre at Lancaster University as Assistant Editor for the Victoria County History of Cumbria project. She coordinates and supports the work of volunteer researchers by providing guidance and skills training. She's played a leading role in VCH Cumbria over recent years and in the great achievement that this new Westmorland volume represents. And I wanted to mention that this May just gone, Sarah was awarded the VCH Outstanding Contribution Award, which I always describe as being like the gold Blue Peter badge of the VCH world, which recognises really outstanding service to the project and to its goals in championing place-based and community history. So that really does, I think, convey how important Sarah is to the VCH project. And I'm going to hand over to Sarah now to tell you a little bit about this 250th volume. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming along to this event. As the title indicates, this VCH volume provides a historical account of Lonsdale Ward. That's to say the 9 townships comprising Kirkby Lonsdale Ancient Parish, 3 townships in Burton and Kendal Ancient Parish, and the township of Dilliker, which is something of an outlier physically and administratively, because that belonged to the ancient parish of Kendal. And I've got actually a map here, so just so we know what part of the world we're talking about. So I hope you can all see that.
Yes.
Lovely, thank you. So Lonsdale Ward is tucked down there in the southeast corner of Cumbria, and this is the patch that we're covering, so including parts of what were Northern Lancashire and West Riding of Yorkshire as well. Lonsdale Ward's a predominantly rural area, but there are also 2 market towns, Kirkby Lonsdale and Burton and Kendal, and there's an industrial element to it too, with flax mills at home. We hope this book has a wide appeal, not only to people who live in the area, but those who are elsewhere who have an affinity with it. It's a beautiful part of the world, and it's been drawing visitors since the 18th century, made famous, of course, by John Ruskin and J.M. Turner. And although the importance of local landscape is a feature of all VCH histories, we've really tried to emphasize that in this volume by including maps with contours in the volume for each township. So we hope that's going to give people a better sense of place and how things like the roads and settlements relate to the landscape. So, and thank you to Kath Dalton for producing those maps for us. Okay, so I'll stop the share there, if that's a...
Great. Is that what you wanted to say at this point, Sarah?
That's fine at this point, yes.
Fantastic. Some teasers there. So, you know, this is radical innovation for the VCH, maps with contours. I'm sure we'll come back to that. And a lovely insight into always the multiple audiences that I think that a VCH Red Book is for. So obviously for local people, but as Sarah says, you know, this is an area beloved by many beyond the local areas. So lots of different kinds of audience. So before we move on to our discussion, I'm now going to introduce Adam Chapman, my colleague here at the Institute of Historical Research. And many of you will know Adam as VCH Co-General Editor. Adam joined VCH Central Office in 2013. Since then, we have published just over 40 books, not all Red books, I don't think, Adam, no. And Adam has edited or co-edited 37 of them. So who better to speak to us about the achievement of the 250th Big Red Book in the context of the VCH's own history, in the context of that research and publishing programme stretching back over 125 years, and perhaps also a bit of what we might look forward to in the future. So over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Sarah. We'll say a bit more about how the Westmorland volume fits into what else Cumbria are doing later. But first say, thank you all for sparing us this time. It's actually quite a nice sunny evening here. I hope it is for you too. The 250th Red Book is quite an achievement for any project. I'm sure it would be, but for the VCH, it is that connects to roughly 2 a year in its 125-year history. Obviously, they've not come out evenly. Some long periods we haven't published anything at all due to small matters like world wars, near bankruptcy, and simple sort of global pandemics, that sort of business. But the project is remarkably durable and remarkably consistent in sticking to what is now just one part of what it does. The Red Books are sort of what the project is known for, and what it's probably their calling card. If your calling card weighs about 1 kilo and makes an almighty thump when you drop it. But there we go. So Hampshire 1, as the title slide sort of indicates, was the first of the Red Books, and the VCH Hampshire project, as now constituted, is a very different beast to that produced Red Books covering the whole county before the First World War. We'll talk a little bit about that. But first, we need to just identify the Red Book model. I think I recognise an awful lot of names on the screen there, so a lot of you, this is going to be superfluous. But for those that aren't so familiar with the VCH, what is a Red Book, and why are they such a big deal in our world? Well, the Red Book model is born from the very beginnings of the project, and its initial aim was to produce a set of Red Books. We still talk of county sets for each county in England, except Northumberland, which I won't, for reasons I won't bore you with, but basically they got started before we could get our act together, so that they did their own thing. But there's Northumberland County History series that looks very similar to VCH in its aspirations and endeavours, but was done quite quickly a long time ago. So the idea was each county was to have a series, 2 introductory volumes detailing religious houses, the Domesday Book where appropriate, and introductory essays to the history of various elements of the county's history, most of which are fairly sort of straightforward: archaeology, which we then called early man, botany and biology, and geology, and things like social history, economic history, and sport, by which they generally meant the more elite end of the sporting world, and possibly a page or 2 on association football if you were lucky. But the initial plan was for 4 volumes per county, so 2 of those introductory volumes and 2 covering the topography on a parish by parish basis of every county. That obviously hasn't worked, or would have been done a long time ago. Oxfordshire, for example, when it's complete, will comprise 23 volumes for its county set. Rutland, I think, comprises 2. So there is obviously some variation, but there is a degree of scope creep as we got more involved. So traditionally, a Red Book, a topographical Red Book with the sort Westmorland 1 is arranged by 100. So a medieval administrative division, which in most counties is sort of geographically coherent. There are some exceptions. Somerset, particularly, as I've learnt to my cost, is not very geographically coherent on a 100-riddle basis, but by and large, that's the approach we took until probably 20 or 30 years ago. Now, a red volume is likely to consist of an urban centre. Urban could be somewhere the size of Sunderland, or it could be somewhere the size of Cumbria Lonsdale, which is about 5,000 people. So urban has a continuum and a stretch. So the red books themselves, obviously, can be presented in a variety of forms. Here is two. The 3D printed thing is courtesy of my colleague Justin Colson, who likes to experiment with these things, and a number of us have them as Christmas decorations for our trees. But there is also this slightly earlier bit of advertorial, if you like, which found wrapping some archival material in the office, which is very much if you have a stockbroker belt type house in Surrey. Here, you can see without try before you buy, holding these very handsome volumes up on your bookshelf to see how they look. These are actual size. And 13 and 6 for a complete county set's not bad value, I suspect, by the time of the day. So obviously that's the model we've been using since 1899, although only one volume, Hampshire 1, was published in Victoria's lifetime. That is the model that persisted up until to the present. But let's look back 20 years rather than 120 years, because that's what I could find in the digital archive. So John Beckett may remember some of these slides because I suspect he wrote them. So the VCH in 2006 was a beast which needed rescuing from local government cuts, fundamentally, because it had become dependent on local government funding. It was still doing good work, doing very good work, but different ways of doing things, different ways of funding needed to be sought. So England's Pass for Everyone was a HLF-funded project, it then was, designed to boost the appeal and awareness of the VCH approach, that is, using primary sources to tell you stories about individual places. And it was an opportunity to revive some counties which had fallen into abeyance. So Kent, Cornwall, Herefordshire, Durham and Derbyshire. Those latter three are in some form or another still going as a direct result of EPE. Although there is a Kent project, it is now completely different to the Kent project that was in place in that. Counties shown in blue on the map are completed counties, those ones where a set of volumes has been done at some point. Mostly a very long time ago, before the Second World War in many cases. Cambridge is the most recent county to be completed in the early 2000s. And the red counties are those then in progress. One of the problems with working with something like the VCH is any sort of visual representation is automatically out of date as soon as you send it to press. So this is the 2006 one, obviously it is. So this slide is one that John might have written, and we could have written it today, actually, which is the reason I've included it. So the VCH was founded to give a sense of what the VCH was intended to do, which in 1999 was produce 150 volumes by 1906, which was heroically optimistic and was was realised probably by about 1901 to be impossible. But there we go. So it is still active, but it's beginning to move in more interesting areas. Well, it's still, this is still where we are. So the VCH needs to align itself with the best there is in English local history. And this is something I think everyone present, I hope, would agree that we're doing. And certainly the Westmorland volume demonstrates in spades. It is a very fine bit of work, drawing on the primary material from the sparse early medieval archives, including place naming, charters, through to the accounts of Turner and John Ruskin, to documentation associated with the construction of the M6 motorway, all sorts of things. So this last paragraph I'd like to draw your attention to here, which is that the VCH will in future stand less for red books and more for quality. A kind of kite mark from little lion eggs in the days of the egg marketing board, which that was not an analogy we'd use today, but it's a good one, it still stands. But the fundamental thing, I think the hope we can all agree on, is if it comes out of the VCH, it must be okay. I'd like to hope it's better than okay, but we produce a lot of stuff. So these books are peer reviewed, they're based on primary research, and hopefully they're presented in a digestible form for the communities they describe. That's the aim. And even for the red books, which are a £95 hardback, is by definition quite a gatekeeping thing to produce. they are, that £95 price point has been preserved for nearly 20 years, so they are getting progressively cheaper with inflation, but that's still quite a lot of cash, which not many people have. So one of the approaches to this was to take the content and the research that underpinned that work and to produce it in different forms. So the EPE paperback series, the precursor of VCH shorts, and now partnership publications, which we'll talk more about later, was one result. And these were very, very colourful, not extensively footnoted in the way a VCH text might normally be, and designed for a different market in conjunction with a commercial partner, then Phillimore and Company, but later History Press. And it brought in more coherent and concerted campaign of volunteering. So this is these slides come from 2006. So Simon Townley can't be here tonight, but many people recognise Simon in the middle of that, looking determinedly at a tomb in a churchyard in Burford. And this fed into the VCH EPE volume, which will in turn fill into the last red book to be completed for the county, which is coming up probably in a couple of years' time, which will be on Burford. Also see those familiar with other long-term people familiar with the project long-term might recognise Matt Bristow pointing at a wall in shorts. I was hoping Matt would come so I could embarrass him with this picture, but he's not here. But that volunteering approach, that volunteer-led approach, the idea that VCH should also be a way of disseminating and enhancing skills is something we still do. Not so much in sort of terms of field work at the moment, but certainly in terms of building our local archives and their connection with the communities they serve, using VCH as a medium to demonstrate how these skills might be used and to extend them more widely. I did warn you that the graphics are always out of date as soon as we publish them, and here we've got a large number of postcards with this really rather nice graphic that Ruth, my colleague Ruth, Matt Leave, hello Ruth, produced. And you'll know this is from 2000. This is just from 2 years ago. We had 247 red books, 39 counties covered, 16 England Past Revenue on volumes. That's still correct. 19 active counties and 21 VCH shorts. Well, of those figures, only the EPE volumes is still correct, as we have expanded. There are now 23 counties which we're active, and two of the historic ridings of Yorkshire. This is by some margin the most active the project has been in over a century. After 1908, we concentrated on 10 counties. That was the first reduction, and since then we've barely gone more than that. There are now 250 big red books. And just for those of you watching in the back, we know this because we actually had to make a spreadsheet to work out how we're going to get the rest of them onto British History Online. And 249 was the figure we arrived at, which caused a certain amount of head scratching because these are topographical volumes. So these are the introductory volumes. There are index volumes as well. We didn't count those. So strictly speaking, we were past 250 some time ago, but an index volume is nothing about the content indexes. So we chose not to count those. The EPE volumes I've mentioned, there are now 23, and that is the final number of VCH shorts, which were a partnership with the University of London Press, and for various reasons relating to how the press needs to operate in the future. That partnership is an end, but it's not an end for short form VCH publication. So there are 3 at the time of typing this, VCH partnership publications, which are very similar in concept. The idea that these are paperback publications at an affordable price, bringing VCH research and with footnotes, I should add. It doesn't seem to put people off, but it's extensively illustrated. These publications that will be published in partnership with other publishers to bring the VCH content to a wider audience at a price point people can actually afford. Going in at about 15 quid, which is a discretionary purchase. A £95 hardback book, even at discount, is not a discretionary purchase for most people. But also as a way of making the project more flexible. We can do a short on a particular place, even if we have no commitment to producing a red book. Red books are brilliant. They are the spine of what we do. They are our calling card. They are what define the VCH approach, but they're not the only thing we do. They are simply the thing that we are known for. And the paperbacks are a way of either building towards that or building out to what people actually want to do in terms of historical terms in partnership with us. Obviously, these are available in a variety of forms. The Red Books are not only available in corporal form, they are available via the British History Online portal. Quite a lot of them are available via the Internet Archive as scans. Let's not talk about the copyright implications of that here, but fundamentally, these are different ways of making this material available, and it's accessible worldwide. If you go back to this thing, the map shown in pink there is of every country where a VCH volume had been accessed on BHO in 2002-3, which is pretty much most of them. And that's quite an impressive demonstration of the reach of English local history, albeit probably in a very small way in some countries, but still, there we are. So we bring us to the 250th, the most recent, and hopefully one of the what will serve as a standard bearer for an approach which has served us well for 120 odd years, and will continue to serve us well as we work towards maybe not completing, but certainly addressing the histories of every place in England, large and small. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. In a little while, as I've said, I'd like to draw in everyone in the room if you'd like to contribute with some of your own stories, memories about VCH Red Books, and some of your thoughts about what the VCH does through those. But I wondered if we could start off with a little conversation with Sarah and Adam. And I'd like to come to you first, Sarah. I mean, first of all, congratulations on this wonderful achievement. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the Cumbria VCH project and how this new 250th and first Big Red Book fits into that. So what does the VCH Cumbria project encompass? What's gone on before in the area? Where has the project come from, and where do you see it going to in the future?
Okay, yes, gladly. Okay, well, the background briefly, I think hot on the heels of Hampshire, VCH was VCH for Lancashire, and that map I showed previously, that Lancashire north of the Sands was covered by that. And I think there were also 2 introductory volumes for Cumberland, published in 1901 and 1905. And after that, nothing, huge long gap until 2010, when Cumbria County History Trust was set up. Not to say that there wasn't a lot of questions and interest from people throughout the 20th century about trying to revive it in Cumbria, but it's taken that long. So the trust was set up to gather resources for the project, and then I was appointed originally as a volunteer coordinator, and I think that's the crucial thing. We always envisaged this project as a volunteer-led. We were going to train a group of volunteers that we recruited from the area to write these histories. So we spent a lot of time converting the national guidance into a Cumbria-specific volunteers handbook for our volunteers to follow, putting on training events for them. And in fact, one of our first volunteers then was Emmeline Garnett, the co-author on this volume, one of our most prolific volunteers. She produced drafts for all of the townships in Kirkby Lonsdale, ancient parish, and some of these were already so good we were able to put them on our project website, I think around 2014, 2015, once we had that up and running. So that provided us with a great starting point when we were thinking, right, we really need to aim for our first Red Book. Where is it going to be? It's like, well, we have this great body of work produced by Emmeline. Let's use that as a starting point. So I think we started thinking about this in 2018, 2019. I think I started. Unfortunately, then COVID hit, which then presented extra challenges in producing this Red Book, as it did for every other researcher. But Emmeline was unfortunately quite unwell and died in 2022. But she knew what we were doing with this. We made sure that we informed her and her family about how we were going to bring these drafts to produce a red book, and she was very happy we were doing that. So my job, if you like, was just to build on what she did, going to additional archives, and it was great. Emmeline had done so much of the legwork, quite literally, within the local community. She did a fantastic job at knocking on doors. She knew lots of people. People wanted to talk to her and tell her about that. So we're immensely grateful for her work and for the local community's response in helping provide information that way. So we were delighted to be able to give a complimentary copy to her family last night, and who were represented at the launch. So I hope she will be proud with our efforts on that. And then we still have a good solid body of volunteers going forward who are working on their own townships. And our plan next is to move to both the north of the county, Cumberland, Eskdale ward, which lies on the border with Scotland, and also then to try and do a rewrite of Lancashire North of the Sands and bring that up to date. Obviously the 20th century needs filling in there. We need to turn it into the national template as it now stands, and particularly things like industry. I mean, I think the section on Barrow is about this long in the original, so we now have a large industrial town that we need to develop. So that's where we've been, we are, and we're going to next. Hopefully I've covered that.
That's great, Sarah. Thank you. Such a rich answer. And I think what it really illuminates for me, and I'm sure others listening, is that this evening we're celebrating the 250th Big Red Book, and we're celebrating that VCH tradition of red books. But of course, the publication itself, and I think this was reflected in John Beckett's comment on that slide, it is so important as an outcome. But the story you're telling, it really shows how the process of reaching that is every bit as important, if not more, in terms of the relationships that are built, in terms of the skills that are developed. And I love your story of Emmeline Garnett's role and what a legacy she has left. But what you described, the expertise and the knocking on doors, it is just a beautiful encapsulation of that kind of marriage of, research and relationship that is so important to kind of doing this VCH work locally. I think I'm going to come back to ask you a bit more about volunteers in a moment, but I was really interested in the way that, of course, you're situating the work for Westmorland One within the broad context of the VCH, going back to its very beginnings. You're talking about archival materials, formal, informal, kind of recent, less recent, that you've drawn on in this work. I wanted, Adam, whether you want to kind of come in here, maybe you both have things to reflect on in terms of whether the VCH archive itself has kind of helped in ways in terms of developing this project, how this project might kind of connect with the beginnings of the VCH. Adam, do you want to kind of draw out any kind of continuities or insights there?
Yeah, sorry, it is interesting in that the initial approach to the VCH under William Page, its first general editor, it envisaged was to do sort of, in machine history in some ways, you could score, and you have a large number of historians, mostly women, dispatched off to the Public Record Office, Chancery Lane as it then was, to go through documents, to a whole series of documents, and to make notes on a sort of arranged by parish or by township, and say, well, this is what we found in this series of documents for this place, and assemble them in slips. And these things, of course, survive. Amazingly, they've been survived in succession of offices. William Page's garden shed, which must have been quite a commodious garden shed. It survived the Second World War in a church attached to an abandoned, deserted medieval village in Northamptonshire, and have now subsequently been dispersed mostly to county archives around the country. This is under John Beckett, again in John Beckett's time. I keep referring back to John because without the modern VCH is really a child of John's organisational skill, and I hope it's hugely appreciated.
We're definitely going to bring John Beckett into the discussion later, so be prepared for that, John. That moment's coming.
Yeah, so John will get his tuppence worth in a bit. But the point is that that material, if you are working on something like Cumbria or Westmorland, you're a long way from Kew. You're a long way from those sort of national calendared sources. This is a way of actually making them more accessible. And okay, the slips, which are little bits of paper, card index sort of styles, may not be immediately obvious what they mean, and they may require you to check things, but you know what you're checking, and that saves a lot of time and a lot of effort from sources which are better catalogued now, but it's not catalogued in the kind of detail which you can draw upon. Of course, we retain some of this material centrally, which is useful for us to tell stories about how this work is done, how it has been done, but also in the case of the Westmorland to reveal that what work had been done initially. So we know, for example, there was a draft volume on the religious houses of Westmorland produced. No idea what happened to it. If anyone comes across the manuscript for that by J.C. Cox, I'd be delighted to hear from you. But we know it existed because Cox refers to it in another publication, and it's mentioned in some of the correspondence that survives here. So while there was no Westmorland volume published, we know that William Farrer, who was the editor of the Lancashire volumes, had started some work towards that before he died. And I suspect he'd have got further with it had he not died when he did. But so we are able to sort of piece together the story about how the project has developed, but also use that material to inform what to save time or to develop our understanding of research that's gone on into the 21st century. So one of the things that the material was able to demonstrate, because access to private archives and the far wilds of the Northwest is not always easy, was that those we could access demonstrated that Farrer's notes were actually pretty accurate, and they were able to trust much more implicitly what he had managed to access because he was of the gentry himself. So that sort of thing is really helpful. It enables us to trust historians that have gone before us. That's brilliant.
I'm just going to add the quote marks around far wilds of the Northwest, as Adam just said. They were definitely there. Actually, I want to respond to something specific that you said, Adam, and bring you back in, Sarah. So I was really struck by your use of the word accessible when you were talking about, research archives, what kind of research is or isn't accessible. And I'd really like to come back to this issue of working with volunteers, Sarah. We know that right across the VCH in many counties, volunteers play an absolutely crucial role in terms of doing the research, often at the very highest level, in terms of supporting and powering the project. But Sarah, you've played a really crucial role in training and supporting volunteers in Cumbria. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that looked like, about what the kind of needs were, what the kind of work volunteers were doing, and how you supported them with that?
When we began the project, I remember we asked all our initial volunteers to complete a sort of training needs questionnaire to find out, had they done any historical research before, even down to how comfortable were they doing online searches of online catalogues and things like that. So we had sessions on those. We teamed up with the local archive service to run sessions on how to come and use the search room. Others were far more adept, and say might want some sessions on paleography, for instance. I think the main thing was how to navigate the VCH template, how to interrogate the source material, what sort of questions should they be asking of it, what to avoid, particularly following the various rabbit holes that you can follow on this. So it was just trying to get to the place where figure out what they were comfortable doing. And I think that was having the flexibility of approach of saying, we want you to do what you're interested in, and then we can help fill in the gaps around that, sort of based on your interest, your skills, your experience. And that, I think it's worked well.
I mean, it really is a beautiful model of real co-production with the community, isn't it? As you say, kind of finding shared interests, so doing that collaboratively. And I think, we often talk about, whether it's lifelong learning or continuing education, and just a really great example of how the Victoria County history in Cumbria and in other places as well is playing a really key role in terms of allowing people to acquire new skills and to find passion, in their own historical research. Really, really important stuff. We're going to talk a little bit more about what the VCH looks like kind of broadly today, and how it's evolving and what it might look like in the future. Just a reminder, those of you in the room, this is because it's a celebration. We're really going to want to hear some of your stories about VCH Red Books as well. So if you have any surprising stories, any funny stories, nothing too shocking, please. Anything that you want to share from your own memories of being involved in producing a Red Book, or your own use of Red Books, encounters with Red Books, the strangest place you've spotted a Red Book, we would love to hear about that. But Sarah, I've been itching to ask you, coming back to Westmorland Volume 1 again, about your personal favourite bits. So that might be your favourite bits as they stand in the completed volume, or maybe highlights for you in terms of that process, in terms of the research journey. So are there any bits of the book or any moments that stand out for you?
Yeah, I was reflecting a little bit on this at the launch last night, and although I'm a medievalist, actually it's not necessarily the medieval land ownership bit that stands out for me as as being highlights. There's so many fascinating stories from each of the townships, but a couple that stand out. Lost chapels that have disappeared and don't necessarily appear that well in the written records, but we have these tantalizing clues that they were there. There's a lovely story attached to one about it being reportedly moved up the fell side all in one night under the cover of darkness, which but the chapel was at the bottom and is now at the top, but that the local tale that was told is that's what happened. And this has happened in the early modern period, so I found myself spending a lot of time trying to unravel what's happened with that, and then I spent a lot of time looking at social housing, which I found fascinating, looking through the local minutes from the town council meetings and local authority council meetings, which certainly could be entertaining on occasion. So yes, I think that was the great thing with the VCH. It allows me to also go and explore so many different avenues that I wouldn't have otherwise professionally maybe ever looked at before. So I learned a lot in doing that. I mean, also some good times in the archives when you find something that you think no one else has ever come across before. So there are maybe a couple of little moments like that. I found a document in Star Chamber proceedings from around 1600, indicting all the women of home, one of the villages there. They had rose up and armed themselves unnaturally, in quote marks, to break down the park walls there. And it was just that as being taken to court by the Lord of the Manor over that. So there's a few moments there could get really excited, and you couldn't wait to write about this, even if I have to keep it brief for the research. But there's definitely maybe fodder for a larger article from that. So yes, I'm storing away a few of these pieces to dine out on later on.
Absolutely, that's great to hear. And I'm sure what you're saying, Sarah, resonates with so many people here who have their own VCH experience. The way that, and I know Adam often reflects on this, the VCH always takes us beyond our own specialism, and it's often in those moments of kind of discovery in periods and fields that weren't perhaps our original specialism, where we can find real joy. And we can all relate to those really exciting moments of archival discovery. That's really great to hear about. Adam, do you have a highlight in the volume?
There's a couple. I mean, the first thing I would say, actually, the highlight is the volume exists at all. Because when I first encountered the Cumbria project, it was I think it was an Anglo-American conference, and I was sort of buttonhole by Angus Winchester. I'd not met before, so and Angus was sort of talking to me about the Cumbria project, trying to indoctrinate me, possibly. And was his conviction was there would never be a red book for Cumbria. He said very clearly, it's not my intention or ambition for this project that it should do that, because that would detract from the breadth of the activity we can do. And of course, so my favourite bit in some ways is that Angus's name appears in the contents page, having written a township himself. But that's partly a joke, partly at Angus's expense, and I have told him this, so it's all right. But my favourite little element is actually about place naming, which is which is a core strand to this book, because in terms of understanding the early landscape and the way in which it transforms, then actually the sort of derivation of place names is really important. But it's not an early place name I'm thinking of, and this is in Angus's chapter in Dilica, which talks about a house which is halfway up. If you're familiar with the Lune Valley and where the M6 and the West Coast Main Line go along the bottom, and the Roman Road goes up one side, it's bleak. I don't mind telling you, it's bleak. And there's a house on one side of the valley, which is now called Mountain View, which is true. That's what you can see from it. But this is excessively bowdlerized from what it was actually originally called, which, well, in the 19th century, it was Cold Seat, which sounds a little bit, but that's a delicate rendering of what it was called in the 17th century, which is Cold Ass. Which is also an accurate description, but it gives you a rather different picture of what living up there must have been like.
Very honest.
But that sort of layering of meaning and sort of how we perceive and what the landscape comes to mean is rather than sort of a hard scrabble existence to something which has a picturesque quality above a major transport artery. Is an interesting way. It's an interesting way of tracking that change. Yeah. I thought that was sort of encapsulates what the volume's doing in some ways. Possibly only the VCH would have actually looked at those sets of sources for publication. Someone looking at the history of their house might have done, but in a sort of terms of a public forum, possibly only the VCH would have actually taken all those sources together and been able to draw out those conclusions. And that's sort of the power of the Red Book, the power of the VCH approach to sort of take place and keep going backwards and forwards and seeing what meets in the middle.
Yeah, that's a lovely example, Adam. Thank you. Now, just before I kind of bring in others in the room to ask questions or to share your own insights and stories, I've got just a sort of a last question for a brief answer from both of you, but I'm afraid it's quite a big question. So just before you all joined, Sarah was telling us a bit about the wonderful launch event in Cumbria last night, which was really well attended and included, the great and the good of the county, the Lord Lieutenant, members of the local parish council, ordinary people who live in the area, who maybe have been involved as researchers, who are interested because it speaks of their place. And really, Sarah, for me, that encapsulated for me the diverse variety of audiences and constituencies that the VCH speaks to, connects with, and works with as well. And my question is kind of in two related parts. Why does the VCH, why does it connect with so many different people in different ways, and sort of how does it do it, and how do we best do that? How are we best doing it now? How do we do it in the future? So thoughts from a Cumbria perspective from Sarah, and any comments from Adam as well. Should we start with you, Sarah?
Yeah, I think it's you could certainly tell on both at the launch last night and in the course of writing the book, the pride people take in their local place, and that this is now being represented. Sorry, that was my lights turning off there in the room. So this book, I think, tries to encapsulate that. Also, the fact that they can be involved in that process, that they have a sense of ownership. And we were always very, we circulated drafts to lots of people, a section asking for their input, as well as coming to them, for support in terms of, have you got anything in your attics that might shed light on this? Any images people have, particularly old photographs they might have in their family that we could use for this. So that there's that sense of ownership, I think, by being involved in that. But also in terms of like who we talk about in the book. I mean, yes, we talk about the local landowners, but there's also some local characters. I think there might be some people in Kirkby Lonsdale today who will recognise some people sort of famous locally, like the blacksmith and people who got involved in the community, years ago. They are talked about. If people who've set up local groups, for instance, but yeah, we've tried to make room to mention them. So these are people they can connect with. It makes it more relevant, I think.
You're muted, Catherine.
Thank you, Adam. I think what I'd also highlight from what you're saying, Sarah, is that really important point about people having a sense of ownership and being involved in the project, being part of it. It doesn't just happen by itself. I mean, you're speaking about proactively sending draft material to people, reaching out and involving people. And I think it's really important that we call attention to and acknowledge that, because, you know, it is that active engagement on your part and the part of your colleagues that involves people in the project in that way. Anything you'd add, Adam?
Yeah, I suppose I'd agree with all of what Sarah said, because, you know, there's nothing like getting a random email from someone saying, "Have you done the history of my village?" When wherever it is, and you probably haven't. It's not very interesting. Well, yes, we have. Here it is. And they just go, "Oh wow!" or "This book's about to be published," and they go, "Well, that's great." And they feedback a little detail here and there, and we're able to incorporate that. That's brilliant. But also going to events and saying, "Oh, you're working on there. I was evacuated there in 1944." It did happen. That was in Toaster, and the person had been evacuated to Minehead in Somerset. And that anecdote appears in the book, because we weren't able to actually work out where people have been evacuated to, from to Minehead. So we were able to actually prove that school, and he was able to provide evidence for that. So those sorts of little things. But also, one of the things that I really value about being a historian in the academy is that the VCH goes out into places the academy does not go.
Yeah.
It's not in the academy is not by and large very interested in, because it can't be. It's not designed to reach out into any place anywhere. But we can sort of act as a bridge to some extent, and we have that consistent interest, which is something which the academy finds hard to do. But also, going the other way, if you say, have a query on some sort of things outside my specialism, and my specialisms are quite broad now, and fundamentally I'm a specialist generalist, as Sarah is, but we're very rare. But if you say we're with the VCH and we want to know about this, it's a very good way of getting. You can approach pretty much any specialist on any subject, and they will say, "Oh, great, VCH, it's useful, great, wonderful. Let me help you, or I can tell you about this." And that it works both ways. So I value that, and I value that role as a bridge. I think that's really important.
A bridge is a really lovely way of describing it. And if we think of each of our red books as a big red bridge as well, I think that's a really lovely way of conceptualizing them. And you've both pointed to that kind of synthesis of scholarly quality, usefulness and interest and feeling that I think really makes what the VCH does very special. So we've got some questions in the chat already. What I'm going to say to everyone is, if you would like to contribute to discussion, you have a couple of different options. You can raise your hand using the Zoom raise hand function, which you'll find if you're using a desktop in the bar at the bottom of the main Zoom window, or you can type something into the chat and I will either pick it up from there or give you the option of speaking on camera if you would like to do that. We're going to come to what's in the chat, but first of all, as promised, John Beckett, we are going to come to you. I warned you this moment would come because you were, of course, VCH director when the Cumbria series resumed. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit from your vantage point about the journey that VCH Cumbria has been on since then, how you feel about this landmark that we're at today, any kind of thoughts or comments or memories that you'd like to share with us.
I would do, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. I wasn't sure how this was working from my end. One of the things is that when I joined the VCH in 2005, and I was told at that stage that there were counties like the West Riding of Yorkshire, which hadn't started, and Westmorland. I was interested in particularly Westmorland and Cumberland because that was what my doctoral thesis had been on many years previously, but it did raise all sorts of interesting points for me. But I was also interested to know what material there was. Now we've talked so far in this discussion about individual communities and so on, but there was still, which I took a particular interest in, the business of the volume 2 in most series, which is the one about all sorts of odds and ends and so forth. But what I discovered was that although there'd been no VCH for Westmorland, there was in fact some material. And I went down to Kew, which was there in those days. The university had its collection of an out store really. And I went down to Kew and found a whole shelves full of material relating to Westmorland. And this was material which had never, as far as I know, been touched by anybody, but it did include a lot of material, some of it relevant. In fact, there are all sorts of chapters written, all sorts of material collected, and they were all there, sitting there on the shelves. But this seemed to me to be a complete waste of space. Nobody knew they were there, so nobody could actually use them because they didn't know they were there in order to use them. Hence the fact that it made sense somehow to move it. And in the end, we managed to get the material out of Kew, and I think it went to the record office in Kendal, but I can't now remember exactly what happened. But I know we released it from all the problems, well, not problems, but we released it from Egham, and much of it was then moved to certainly into Westmorland. I'm not quite sure where it went to. Sarah may know that better than I do, but there was a lot of stuff there, and it was a really, I thought, a good starting point. But of course, the modern VCH doesn't really operate in that way because it functions largely on townships and elsewhere parishes and so forth, rather than worrying about all these unwritten histories at Egham. But they did include a lot of work by Farrer, who was the great man for, we know him for the great man for volume 8 in the Lancashire volume, but he also did a great deal of work for the Westmorland volume, which again wasn't published. But I've discussed that in the past with Mike Winstanley, and he's done some work on Brownbill, who was the great collector with Farrer. So there may be more to be said there, and so on. But yes, it was quite fun going down to Egham and finding hundreds of envelopes. The envelopes that I think Adam mentioned earlier were created by many of the female researchers. I've got a lot more on that, but I've probably had my time now, so I'll pass it back to whoever is next in the queue.
That's just wonderful to hear, John. And of course, many of you here will know that John has done so much important work in terms of researching and writing the history of the VCH itself. And so really great to hear your insights. And I'm quite struck by John's use of the word stuff here, the excitement of discovering stuff. But, you know, this is quite important. I think that the VCH is an unusual kind of archive. It remains dispersed. It's not all in one place. And we are all custodians of that irreplaceable, hugely valuable archive for this national project, you know, in our different sort of local settings. Thank you, John. I'm going to come to some of the questions and comments in the chat. And again, it would be lovely to hear from any other people who are interested in sharing their own Red Book stories. So I'm going to come to a question from Chris Curry, first of all. And he asks, do we feel that the decline of adult education classes and groups like WEA, extramural university teaching and so on, has paradoxically helped to attract people to work as local volunteers for the VCH? I think that's a really interesting, Chris. I have some thoughts on that myself, but Adam and Sarah, I mean, Sarah, from your Cumbria perspective, Adam, looking across the VCH, what are your responses? Sarah?
Oh, well, yes. I mean, I know, just like speaking from my volunteers, that they sign up to an awful lot of courses that university offer, particularly online courses. They're very keen on those, and I think it's nice because the VCH, I think, bolsters their confidence and vice versa doing these sort of courses. But yes, I've not actually thought about whether it's actually benefiting us if these courses are and groups are going into decline, whether that might help attract more volunteers to us.
I suppose nobody wants these things to be in decline, do we? Of course.
No, yes,
but yeah, I do wonder whether there's a gap. And I think, Adam, sometimes this is what we hear from our colleagues in Wiltshire and Gloucestershire, I think, running their local history training series. Could you maybe tell us a bit about that, Adam?
Yes, I mean, I think that there is certainly a regional element to this. Whereas you look at volunteers in Hampshire in particular, a lot of them have come through the Oxford Conted certificate in local history. And obviously Oxford being that dominates that sort of region. So there's that, but Wiltshire and Gloucester, I think, partly responding to the trend Chris is talking about, but also partly because of their ongoing relationship with the archives, have established a series of courses, sort of basically a sort of primer in local history topics and sources, which they have hosted the respective archives in Gloucester and at Chippenham, to try and bring the skills together, bring how these systems work. What is a manor court? How does that work? Get a proper specialist to come and actually perform the manor court with some documents and show this is how it's done. And I say perform, I mean literally. It's Mark Forrest with his pepper pot, investing himself as a manorial official. But also that element of training and teaching is part of that bit, which is good for the archives, and it gets people through the door. It builds their skills and confidence. And confidence, I think, is really key. And it's a model that certainly run successfully in Gloucestershire twice, and in Wiltshire once. I think they're going to run it again, and we're building expertise out into a new project in Lincolnshire and Spalding, where they're doing something very similar. Which reminds me, I've got an email to send, but it's a thing that we're looking at doing in Staffordshire. It's a thing that we're looking at doing elsewhere because of I think if that translates into volunteering, then great. But it's also performing a good for on a communal basis in general. It's saying we have the skills. We want you to have these skills so you can do what you want to do. And if that involves doing stuff for the VCH as well, then brilliant. But it doesn't have to be. The VCH can be a sort of trusted partner in those sorts of exercises, and it helps the archives. It keeps our relationships good with them, but also they get something from us too. And local government, it helps get people through the door, and that in local government funding position being where it is helps in that respect. So it's a virtuous circle in some respects.
And I think what you're describing, Adam, and you too, Sarah, this kind of peer support model that's there in the VCH is so important in terms of the ethos of the project and the sustainability of the project as well. So, Adam has described, the new project setting up in Lincolnshire. There are other places where the VCH is kind of getting going again after having not been active. And people with expertise from other parts of the VCH community kind of advising and helping with that, and training each other. So if you're here in the room and you're involved in the VCH and you have skills, we may well be coming to you to see if you want to be involved in this kind of peer support and training. And of course, we are all always actively learning from each other as well, which is really important. Some really important comments from Bazak in the chat. Noting how important, of course, it is to make sure that we name and acknowledge volunteers and the work that they do. And I think that is, Bazak, something that the VCH takes really seriously, and that does very much happen. And another interesting comment from Bazak, that maybe if people aren't in work, that volunteer work can be something very rewarding and enriching that they might find through the VCH. A comment from Nicholas since the higher education reforms of the Cameron government, part-time courses in person have become very expensive. Yes, that's true, isn't it? And if you volunteer, there's an opportunity to learn and to help organisations who rely on that volunteer labour. So I think, you know, Nicholas has put his finger on it there, hasn't he? That, and I think, Sarah, we saw that in all the examples you gave of this kind of shared benefit, and everyone, you know, is getting something out of this. That's what makes it work. Felicity Jones, it's lovely to have you with us. You've put a question in the chat. I wondered if you wanted to speak that on camera or if you want me to read that from the chat. So Felicity worked as a fundraiser at the IHR on the England's Past for Everyone project. So it's great to have you back with us, Felicity. I'll hand over to you.
It's a very long time ago, and I'm really delighted to be here and see what you've all been doing since I left. And hello, John. One of my comments was actually in the context of now increasingly other kind of cultural and heritage organisations having to rely on volunteers. And there's actually an increasingly competitive market for volunteers, and their expertise and their input is not being valued, but is being heavily relied upon. And I wondered if there was thought given. Now I was struck by Adam really kind of hitting the nail on the head that the VCH has always recognised volunteer input as expertise and has acknowledged that and provided routes to acknowledge that. And whether there was thought about actually talking about it more broadly across the sector, actually as a model of volunteering as well as a model of research. Anyway, delighted to be here, and I was really proud to work on England's Past for Everyone.
Oh, Felicity, thank you so much, and a really great question. Adam, Sarah, who would like to respond to this one first? I mean, what I'll say while you're both kind of reflecting is that, I mean, I think this is a really live, a really important subject, Felicity, and our colleague Ruth Slatter, who is co-general editor of the VCH alongside Adam Chapman, and who's currently on maternity leave, but I think might be in the room this evening, has recently published some really important work, I think, on exactly this, on the VCH as a model of knowledge exchange and community history and co-production. Has done quite a lot of work with the University of the Highlands and the Islands in Scotland, looking at kind of volunteer involvement in making history. And I know Ruth has also given quite a lot of thoughts, again, often talking to collaborators and partners working in different contexts, to this thorny issue of how you fully value and recognise the work of volunteers. And there are real complexities there, but we will share a link to Ruth's research. Adam and Sarah, anything you would want to add to that?
Yeah, well, just following on from the workshop that I did with Ruth, I think the more organisations that can get together and share these experiences about how they work with volunteers, how they show their appreciation for the volunteers, the better. That was a very useful exercise for us at the VCH to hear from other organisations, and I hope that they also got some benefit from learning about what we do as well, so you're not in isolation. Although yes, it's a point that we perhaps are now all competing for people's time to come and work with us. I hope that our volunteers feel valued. We do try and stress it everywhere and anywhere we can, the importance of their role, and I don't think we would not have a project without them at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I live up in the northwest, and I think Cumbria is a very interesting example of a county-wide volunteering programme as well, volunteering hands. So yeah, anyway, it's good to see you.
It's a really important topic, and I'm glad you've got us talking about it, Felicity. And it's a real joy to see our colleague Ruth with her hand raised. Lovely to see you, Ruth. I'm so glad you're able to come in on this.
I do have a small person next to me, so apologies for baby noises in the background. But thank you so much, Felicity, for those comments. And I think I just wanted to come in because I also was interested in the what Bazak said in the chat about this kind of issue around volunteering and paid work as well. And this is something that the IHR thinks about a lot. And we have an internship which is kind of paid. It's not paid by hours, but it has a kind of bursary attached to it, because I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are people who can't do voluntary work, that there needs to be some way of making sure that their time is paid for. And this is something that we're very aware of within the VCH, that our volunteers currently are meeting a particular profile because they're the people who have the time, they have the resources to be able to volunteer. And this is something that Sarah and I were talking about a lot, wasn't it, Sarah, in terms of how do we expand and increase the range of people who are volunteering? That's quite difficult when we don't have the capacity to pay people. And what do we do about that? So that's something that we're kind of thinking about, but is a really difficult circle to square, I suppose. But I just wanted to acknowledge that as well, because I think it's, you know, when we're talking about volunteers, we shouldn't just be talking about crediting them, which we do. It's also about some people just cannot volunteer. That isn't within their capacity to do so.
Thank you, Ruth. And a goal that Ruth has often articulated that I think we all share. I know, Ruth, you've put it in the past that what we really aspire to in the VCH is that our history is written by people who reflect the people who live in our places, so that we have that same diversity in those who write our histories of place as diversity that's found in those communities, and part of being able to kind of support volunteers in the best possible ways is one route towards that. But with all those challenges, those ever-present VCH challenges around funding and around budget and those other constraints as well. Thank you so much for coming in on that, Ruth. And I've shared a link to the article by Ruth that I mentioned in the chat. I want to come to Trixie's question in the chat because it's a brilliant one. Trixie, do you want to join us on camera to ask this? Otherwise, I can read it from the chat. So Trixie is involved in the new Dorset project, which is hugely exciting, and I have a kind of personal investment in this as someone who lives right at the formerly Hampshire end of the county but grew up in Dorset. So Trixie is involved in this newly re-emerging Dorset project. Trixie wonders, do you have tips on important foundations to get right from the outset before participation potentially snowballs? This feels like a brilliant question for you, Sarah, because you're just, you know, at the end of the life cycle of one particular VCH project. If you cast your mind right back to the start, what worked, or do you have any kind of do's and don'ts to share with us? And then we'll bring John back in on volunteers.
Yeah, oh, thank you. No, it's a great question, Trixie. I think, yes, if it potentially snowballs, that's a great thing, but I appreciate that also brings problems in terms of managing people. I think you have to be prepared to give them something to do, clear instructions from the outset. How many people can you manage? It can be very time consuming. In fact, you know, my role with the project was initially just as volunteer coordinator. I wasn't researching and writing anything myself in those days. It was purely looking after the volunteers and their needs. So creating guidance sheets for them, meeting with them physically, trying to get people in a room, all of that to offer training and to talk through what we need them to do. I mean, the VCH, you have this template to adhere to. There are lots of rules and things, so everyone has to be, you know, singing off the same hymn sheet. So making sure everybody's on board and knows what they're doing and is comfortable with what they're doing. So that does take an awful lot of time to get right. So if it helps, I mean, I'm happy with maybe a dozen people. I work part-time, so having a dozen people actively researching and writing, like a whole place, or indeed a small group of people. Several of our volunteers do work together. But we also had, at the outset, had a project that more people could be involved with, but wasn't quite as hands-on from me. So we did a project called the Jubilee Digest project when we first set up, which was to get we made an advert, sent it out there saying we would like everyone to gather very, very specific sets of facts from these 5 specific sources, fill in this form and email it into us. And then, so we sent that out there in the world, and we had hundreds of people responding to that. And so it meant we got a little potted history under the main VCH headings for 548 places, which we could then later on use to put on our website. So it had a purpose, gathering all this information, but it also it meant that, okay, my inbox was filling up with all these return forms, but it came with clear instructions. But it was great that we then had so many people involved on that, but slightly more to arm's length than the researchers and writers. So having different ways in which people can volunteer, and being quite clear on that from the start, is a good one.
Those are really helpful insights, Sarah. And I can see we've got people in the room from VCH Hampshire and VCH Essex and elsewhere, but lots of other VCH experience in working with volunteers. I'm sure some of what you've said has resonated there. Can I bring John back in? I think you wanted to come back in on this point about volunteers.
Just briefly, until relatively recently, volunteers were not encouraged by the VCH. In fact, there was an extent to which it was discouraged. And so what's now being done and the way it's being done, which is really important for its longer term vitality, really, because there are still, I think, people out there who will not really be very keen on the VCH in terms of volunteering. They think it should be paid for, which is fine, but what we have to cope with, or what I'm aware of coping with, was that where you haven't got any money, you have to look at other ways of proceeding. And that was what largely led to much of the work that was done in my time to actually come up with ideas of how you do volunteering and what you do with it and so on. And I spent a lot of time in Hampshire just for that reason, because they had an active group under Jean Morin looking at and working on what had effectively been, or was effectively, the second series of Hampshire, because it was the first volume on the second time round, if that makes any sense to you.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah. And I think, can I just come in on that really briefly as well, John? Just wanted to respond to what you said about we all know the pragmatics around volunteers and money, but I think what's come through really strongly from what Sarah has said and what Adam has reflected on is that involving volunteers in the VCH its value is far beyond that, because it's involving different kinds of experience and expertise and knowledge. So moving to this model where so much VCH work is done by people as volunteers in their own communities, that enlarges and expands on the kind of academic knowledge that others in the project bring, is a huge asset and really transformative in terms of the kinds of work that the VCH can do, especially in a present and a future where we're producing big red books, but also through partnership publications, outputs that might look really different, be really different shapes and forms for really different kinds of audience, reflecting those very different kinds of expert knowledge of place. Back to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to sort of add into that we did face this all through the early years of the project, quite strong resistance and comments from people about you're using volunteers, sort of slightly aghast about that. And I think, though, it really helped on our first publication, which was actually a paperback, a short in 2019, which was produced by a volunteer. And that was then great that we had something we could hold up and say, look, this is what volunteers can do. And indeed, that volunteer, I know him, Richard Rockington, the author, he then goes around talking to people and saying, yeah, if I can do it, you can do it too. And then that's a great advert for the other volunteers in terms of it, encouraging them that it is possible, that this is not just something to be written by academics in universities. You can have a go.
I'm just to echo that point about Richard. I went to the launch of that book, and Richard was so generous about everybody involved in that project. I've never been thanked as an editor directly before at launch, which is nice. So taken some, really demonstrated to the audience in the room the value of the editorial skills, not just mine, Sarah's too, I should add, in taking his research, which he knew what he could do and what he couldn't do, and making it the best it could be. By accessing things he hadn't been able to lay hands on, by saying, do you mean to say this like this rather than like this? That iterative process was something he was very open about and very appreciative of. And that's obviously that's an example of Sarah's brilliant relationship management as much as anything else, and Richard's generosity of spirit too. And we've been very lucky, I think, with that. But certainly we have authors who have never written anything at all, not even for a parish magazine, not even sort of for a blog or anything, and they have written a piece of primary research, peer-reviewed academic text, from scratch, and that blows my mind. That's quite a hard thing to do. And that's them. We can help, we can turn it into a book, but that's their willpower and their willingness to learn and their willingness to actually go and explore things and challenge themselves that's brought about that result. And that from my point of view is hugely satisfying. Even if my input is relatively checking footnotes.
So look, we're in the last few minutes now, really, and I wonder if we can kind of pan out again from our wonderful Westmorland Volume 1 250th Big Red Book to VCH Red Books as a whole. And I'm going to ask you in a moment, Adam, if you might want to share a kind of a favourite Red Book recollection or story or memory. And, any of us here, whether you want to raise your hand or whether you want to perhaps just add into the chat anything that stands out for you. And I think for me, as well as the experience of being involved in this project, one of the things that I find a real joy in are those kind of encounters with Red Books, spotting them, meeting them, and seeing them in the wild. Just a couple of weekends ago, I was at Kenwood House in Hampstead for the first time. I know it's shocking, isn't it? And when I went into the beautiful library there, admiring my surroundings, what did I find but a very extensive run of VCH Red Books, almost to the present, a really almost complete run, and just so wonderful to see those as a collection and to meet those on shelves, whether it's in kind of archives, whether it's behind then Prince Charles speaking to the nation during the coronavirus lockdown at Easter 2020. It's great seeing how they form a kind of a touchstone really in our national history and our story. So if anyone has any particular Red Book memories or stories, do share them with us in the chat. But Adam, do you have a favourite moment, either as an editor or as a user or as a spotter of VCH Big Red Books, that you might share with us?
Oh, I suppose editorially, I suppose the first volume I looked at was special to me because it was actually a selection of villages just down the road from where I was brought up. And being able to actually get a sense of what those places were like historically, and getting which was brilliant. That it really brought home to me the process of what the project is about, and to change just ever so slightly influenced the way it was written to say, well, this is how it would speak to the community. So just taking the Great West Road as the author described it, and I said, Mary, do you mean the 303? And she says, oh, yes, it is now the A303. No one will know what you mean if you say the Great West Road. If you call it the 3, you don't even put the A in. If you call it the 303, everybody within 20 miles will be able to visualize that bit of the landscape. Just that little sort of, and it was shaped around that for me. It's the linear route for it. But also, that book also has a purse come from my dad in. Because he's lived there for 40 years. His opinion and his knowledge of that area is every bit as valid as anyone else's. I know, 50 years now. But so that sort of sense of being able to build your practice as a historian, if you like, into somewhere I just I found, if I thought at that point I was on a 2-year fixed term contract, I thought if I do nothing else in this project, I've gained that. contributed to this history of my world, my landscape, my place, if you like. And that you know, I found that hugely satisfying. That's a bit selfish.
Adam, that is a beautiful place for us to end, really, because you brought us back to that alignment, that synthesis between the academic and the personal, the scholarly and feeling. Sarah used that word pride very strikingly early on, which is really at the heart of the VCH project. And I think so much of what we've discussed today really speaks beyond the VCH as well, to the vitality and the importance of local and place-based and community history. You know, people care deeply about their places and are invested in understanding their past and being custodians of them in the present and into the future. And it's lovely to see Christine sharing in the chat a similar experience, encountering a run of all but a couple of VCH volumes, filling a shelf along an entire wall. We know that feeling.
We can rectify the ones they're missing. Okay.
Fantastic. Well, look, I think
good for the money, I'm sure.
I think it is now time to draw this conversation to a close. It has been wonderful to be able to mark this milestone for the VCH, our 250th Big Red Book, and to look forward, I think, with an awareness of complexities and challenges, but also a huge amount of optimism and hopefulness for the future of the VCH. So I'll conclude by asking you all to thank our speakers, Adam Chapman and Sarah Rose, and especially to congratulate Sarah and her colleagues in the Cumbria County History Trust once again on this landmark volume. Thank you so much.